On the 29th of October 1956, Israel launched a war against Egypt. 2 days later, it became clear that Britain and France were Israel's senior partners, and that the central target of the two colonial powers was to restore their hold over the Suez Canal. A fearsome international storm erupted, and the three belligerents quickly abandoned their grand plan and withdrew their forces. While short and militarily uneventful, the Suez War is generally considered a watershed event in the history of the Middle East. It signaled the end of the colonial era and the beginning of the transformation into a battleground between the US and the USSR. To start, let's identify the key major powers that were in play. First comes Egypt, where in 1952, Abdel Nasser rose to power following a coup that brought down King Farouk. Nasser hoped to mold the Arabs into a major, non-aligned power in one united state. He wanted to break free of Europe's economic grip and destroy the encircling Baghdad Pact alliance, forged by the Eisenhower administration. In 1955, Nasser struck an arms deal with Czechoslovakia, raising the prospect that the most populous Arab state might be sliding into the Soviet orbit. As a man, Nasser was more of a pragmatic leader rather than an ideologue as he's often portrayed. He swung between different groups trying to gain the most benefit for himself. When the Ikhwan, a radical Islamist group, was the most powerful and organized social force in the country, he saw it as having the capacity to bring about the changes that Egypt so badly needed. Indeed, he was convinced that Ikhwan's well-organized underground network was ideally placed to carry out attacks against British troops in the Suez Canal zone and to plot for the eventual overthrow of the British-backed monarchy. Nasser was also a veteran of the Israeli War of Independence of 1948, which played a crucial part in the development of his character. The loss of a united Arab force only strengthened his belief in the need for a strong military movement that would be able to crush the enemies and unite Arabs. In addition, after the war, Nasser saw Jews as a particular threat to Egypt and any other Arab state. In his mind, Jews replaced the British as a main colonial evil, and it was a mission of his life to fight against it. This led to an increase in anti-Semitism and the appearance of a number of paramilitary radical organizations that raided bordering Israel villages. Nevertheless, there was no direct link connecting these raids to Nasser. The next two forces of the conflict were Britain and France. At the time, both countries were not in their best shape. For years, they have been losing their colonial lands and influence. Both were desperate in their attempts to maintain their position as world superpowers, and therefore Egypt's actions evoked a devastating response. British Prime Minister Anthony Eden was in particular passionate about radical and military solutions. Suez Canal was built and operated by a company jointly owned by the British and French governments. The canal was and still remains an important strategic location. It is a key arteria of global trade, which allows for the ships to cross to the Mediterranean Sea without the need to go all around Africa. This means the country that controls the canal is able to instantly provoke a global crisis by shutting it down. Because of this, the stakes were raised even higher. The last thing Western countries wanted to do was give full control over such an important location to a newly emerged Arab dictator who was not willing to compromise. The fourth country that played a huge part in this crisis was Israel. After the 1948 War of Independence, Israel's objective remained the same: survival. The neighboring Arab states were portrayed as enemies that could launch another full invasion at any moment. In order to reform and modernize its military, Israel made a number of deals with Britain, and in most cases France. This made Israel depend on aid coming from these countries, and therefore refusal to participate in the operation was not an easy option. Before the crisis reached a climax in late 1956, the British and Americans discussed different options for subduing Nasser. Eisenhower hoped to encourage local and international political resistance against him through a secret operation called Operation Omega, which aimed to use both diplomacy and covert action to thwart his ambitions in the Arab world. Eden instead wanted to take a much more direct approach. In conjunction with the British Secret Intelligence Service, Eden worked on plans to assassinate Nasser either covertly or through a large-scale invasion. In his eyes, Nasser was comparable to Hitler and needed to be eliminated as soon as possible. In letters to Eisenhower and in discussions with the Secret Service, Eden made frequent comparisons between Nasser, Hitler, and Mussolini. On July 26, 1956, Nasser spurred a major crisis by nationalizing the Suez Canal. His goal was to get rid of any colonial presence in Egypt. Nasser was prepared to go to war. As a response in October, French President Mohamed Eden and Israeli Minister of Defense Ben-Gurion met secretly in Sèvres, France, and came to the agreement behind perhaps the modern Middle East's oddest war. Israel would attack Egypt, and Britain and France would then follow suit with their own intervention, which they would call an attempt to separate the combatants. In the end, all three agreed that Nasser should be toppled and free navigation through the canal should be restored. All agreed to keep all the information secret from the US, which will prove to be their biggest mistake. Following the meeting, Ben-Gurion returned to Israel and tried to sell and justify the decision to start a war to other ministers. It was mentioned that if Israel declined the French proposal, it could have lost the generous support and cooperation of the French. There was also the temptation to seize an opportunity, join the Allies and bring about a new Middle East order with a weakened Egypt and a stronger Israel. The decision was made, and on October 29, 1956, 10 Israeli brigades invaded Egypt and advanced toward the canal, routing Egyptian forces. Britain and France, following their plan, demanded that Israeli and Egyptian troops withdraw from the canal, and they announced that they would intervene to enforce a ceasefire ordered by the United Nations. On November 5th and 6th, British and French forces landed at Port Said and Port Fouad and began occupying the canal zone. The United States' response was immediate and ruthless. President Eisenhower put diplomatic pressure on Britain and France through the introduction of a UN ceasefire resolution. The United States aimed to lead a ceasefire resolution before the Soviet Union presented its own resolution. They wanted to prevent Moscow from seizing a mantle of world leadership through a false but convincing exhibition of concern for smaller nations. An emergency United Nations session was then called on the 1st of November. Dulles introduced a ceasefire resolution that passed by a margin of 64-5. Along with Britain, France, and Israel, Australia and New Zealand were the only other countries to oppose the resolution. In the end, enormous diplomatic, economic, and military pressure eventually forced Israel, Britain, and France to agree to a UN ceasefire and an emergency peacekeeping operation on the 6th of November, enabling an Anglo-French withdrawal from the canal. London and Paris had nothing to show for all their efforts in Suez, except failure and embarrassment. As the US Embassy in Cairo reported to Washington, the British and French gained nothing except loss of prestige and increased hatred of Arabs. Shouldering the brunt of the blame and embarrassment for the crisis, Eden resigned as Prime Minister on the 9th of January 1957. For all the shock and surprise surrounding events in Suez, his resignation was predicted. As for Israel, the Suez Crisis taught the Israeli national security establishment a lasting lesson. Surprising the United States has serious consequences. A preventive war that startled the United States and interfered with its vital interests carried a heavy price, including the largely unrewarded return of the territorial gains that Israel made from the IDF's tactically skillful 1956 campaign. Surprising the United States may have been the price that Ben-Gurion chose to pay for working with Britain and France to reduce the threat from Nasser in 1956. But future Israeli policymakers would conclude that their great power patron of choice lay not across the Mediterranean, but across the Atlantic. On the other hand, Nasser emerged from the Suez Crisis as a victor and a hero for the cause of Arab and Egyptian nationalism. The crisis was followed by strong anti-Semitic policies and ethnic cleansing of Egyptian Jews. In the following years after the crisis, nearly 100% of Egyptian Jews were driven out of their homes and deported. The Suez Crisis is one in the chain of events that marked the final degradation of the colonial order. The lack of communication with the US led to a conflict of interests and views which forced the three countries to back down. Neither of them was ready for a diplomatic fight with America, which was the strongest economy and military power in the world. Britain and France went to the back seats, with the United States and USSR coming to the front. A new phase was emerging which would later be called the Cold War.